Hello and welcome to the first episode of Fashion Elements. Today we will be talking about the impact that the international system has on the fashion industry. Of course, we'll also be talking about how the pandemic has shaped the industry, and also whether some of the changes will remain after the pandemic ends. Another topic we will be covering are some new developing markets that could become quite interesting for the fashion industry in the near future. Today with us we have Sandili Slopi, who is a partner at EY and as a member of the Africa region leadership team. We have Malte Kaeding, who is a senior lecturer in international politics at the University of Surrey. We have Filippo Prini, who's a project leader at Boston Consulting. And we have Danilo Taino, who's a series correspondent, senior correspondent and columnist at Corriere della Sera. Now, our first guest today is Dr. Kaeding. He will talk to us about the impact that the international system has on production. So if everyone is ready, I would leave it to Dr. Kaeding.
Right, so I'm going to talk about how geopolitics influences industry production and markets. So in the international political economy, there's the literary textbook example, which illustrates this commodity chain of neoliberal economic trade order and the relation between production and market, and that's always the life of a t-shirt. So that's my link here to fashion. More importantly, the journey from cotton growing in the US, manufacturing in China, and then again sales in the US or Europe, and eventual donation maybe to a developing country in Asia or Africa shows the nature of the global economy as we know it. And the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the weaknesses of this neoliberal consensus. So the international political economy of production has become a heated topic, a heated political issue. And COVID-19 is actually only one of the challenges to the development of the global economy. So we have questions about sustainability in a time of climate change crisis, the relationship between production and social reproduction or migrations or others. And of course, the prospects of rapid automatization raises really important issues on work organization and labor rights. Some of these actually, I think, have been foreshadowed already by the pandemic. So the liberal approach is to some extent almost discredited by the realities of these challenges. And the question is, if we now see maybe a return towards a more mercantilist approach in policies. So some of these were actually promoted by the Trump administration, but not only there are also some indications that in Europe production is coming closer back home. These debates we have seen, for example, talks about digital sovereignty, state-led green energy, innovation, and the return of some of these overseas production lines. And of course, among all this, the threat of China always looms, but I'm sure that Mr. Tainter will talk about this much more later. So I go back to the international political economy, and Susan Strange argues that the international political economy is based on four foundations or structures: production and trade, money and finance, security, and knowledge and technology. And I want to focus a little bit on production. So who produces what, for whom, and on what terms? This is really at the heart of the international political economy. So when you remember these big geopolitical changes, such as the fall of the Iron Curtain, the collapse of the Soviet Union, how this contributed then to changes in the international trade rules. So the consequences have been a shift of production to new emerging economies in Eastern Europe, for example, Latin America, and of course, most importantly, in Asia. So governments in these countries, of course, always try to attract FDI, so foreign direct investments. And in Western countries, on the other hand, we see on the domestic level then maybe unions, but also manufacturers lobbying their own governments for more protectionist barriers against cheap imports, for example, from China in order to preserve jobs there. So here you can see a link back or potential link back to the international level again, when governments might attempt to bring about change on the international level through organizations like the WTO again. I think the most obvious link between geopolitics and production and markets is, of course, in extractive industries. Maybe a couple of years, you remember the debates about rare earth and how they're all linked, located in China, and what will happen if there's any conflict between China and other countries, or of course oil production. Yeah? So this is a commodity concentrated in so few countries that each time there's a political crisis, this will hit production and markets in various forms. And often these production fluctuations are linked to international sanctions, like in the case of Venezuela or in the Middle East, for example. So one of the most, talking about sanctions, I think one of the most interesting cases to study is, of course, the US-China trade war and the role sanctions have played there. Maybe you remember that the US has, by citing security concerns about the close relationship between Huawei, the telecommunication company, and the Chinese state, plus Iran sanctions violation, had added Huawei to this entity list. So this meant also having a ripple-on effect on European partners, treatment of Huawei as access to the US markets for the Europeans and access to security information by the US would be impacted if Huawei would have been allowed into critical infrastructure, communication infrastructure in Europe. So for Huawei, this actually destroyed their global supply chain, with key US suppliers now stopping to provide chips for them, as well as Taiwanese chip makers as well, stopping the supply. And if we look at the profit side, who benefits from this? Of course, the first example is Samsung, of course, as Huawei is a big competitor in the mobile phone sector, but also as a country, Taiwan. So Taiwan did announce its own 5G chip production cooperation with Nokia and further production in this area last year, and is also investing heavily into research and development, AI, 5G, to provide secure technology for the US and European markets. So in some form, Taiwan directly benefits economically from this increasing geopolitical confrontation between China and Western countries. But of course, when we talk about Taiwan, we have to remember that China is just next door. So security-wise, it doesn't profit from these heightened tensions. And of course, both economies, Chinese and Taiwanese, are heavily integrated. But why I talk about China and Taiwan is because this also offers, I think, a glimpse into the link again between geopolitics and production, where we look at COVID-19 and the impact of the pandemic. So as you know, Taiwan is one of the few countries who is domestically very little affected by COVID-19. So things are actually going on as almost as normal as before, thanks to a very early and very strict countermeasures. So that meant that while other Asian countries, their economies suffered quite significantly in the first half of 2020, with growth rates dropping between 7.7 in China percent and 11.2 in South Korea, Taiwan actually maintained an average growth rate of 1.5% during the same time. And overall, it had outpaced China in growth last year. So we can, and I will end with this, we can therefore understand why the Chinese government has pushed for an opening of the economy and an early return of almost normal production in early summer last year already. Maybe you remember that they opened all these factories, switching on the light, nobody was there, but they wanted to send this message, we're again open for business. And since August 2020, actually, China has been starting its vaccination program. So they started vaccinating people, firstly, those who travel for business overseas to keep the connections to raw material suppliers and key markets, especially in Africa. So the willingness to go ahead with this vaccine, a vaccine that might not really fulfill the efficiency and safety requirements we're used to, illustrates really that the assumed advantages of this, going ahead with this vaccine, are worth the risk for the Chinese government to take. And I think it remains to be seen how this approach will then affect global politics and the global economy. Thank you very much.